A colony of bees has no heater. It has no furnace, no insulated wall, no external source of warmth. What it has is a cluster, a living, breathing, metabolic engine made entirely of bees, and whether that engine runs through February depends almost entirely on decisions the beekeeper made in August. That is the part modern beekeeping consistently gets wrong. Have you ever lost a strong colony to a winter you cannot fully explain? If that question still sits unresolved, leave a comment below. The answer likely begins months before the cold arrives. If you have watched strong colonies die quiet winter deaths without understanding why, this video is worth staying with and worth a like. In the mountains of Appalachia, beekeepers working in the early decades of the 20th century reported winter survival rates that by today's standards seem almost impossible. 4% colony loss, not 40, not 25, 4%. And they achieved it not through chemicals, not through intensive manipulation, not through anything that required a product catalog or a shipping address. They achieved it by understanding something about the biology of the winter bee that the industrialization of beekeeping has since pushed to the margins. The problem in this story is not winter itself. Winter is not the enemy. The problem is what the colony was before winter arrived. And beekeepers across the Appalachian range in the early decades of the 20th century understood this distinction with uncommon clarity, not because they had laboratory equipment, but because they had generations of direct observation and very little margin for error. A dead colony in those mountains was not a statistic. It was the loss of an adapted, locally selected population that might take years to replace. When a colony fails in February or March, the modern instinct is to examine the winter conditions: wrapping, moisture control, ventilation, entrance reduces. These are legitimate concerns. No one is dismissing them. But what Appalachian beekeepers of that era focused on was not the winter. It was the colony that went into the winter. It was the August colony, the September colony. The colony raising the final generation of bees before the cold locked in, because that generation is not like any other. It is not biologically equivalent to summer bees. It is not physiologically the same as spring bees, and most modern beekeeping calendars treat it as though it were. Those bees are called fat bees, and most experienced beekeepers have heard the term. But what most beekeepers misunderstand is this: fat bee production is not automatic. It is not guaranteed by a warm August or a healthy laying queen. It is guaranteed by one thing and one thing only: protein. Specifically, the availability of high-quality late-season pollen at the precise moment the colony is raising the bees that will carry it through winter. That window is narrower than most beekeepers account for, and once it closes, no autumn intervention fully recovers it. Fat bee, lost window. That is the biological fault line between a colony that survives and a colony that does not. The fat body of a winter bee is not fat in the casual sense of the word. It is a specialized biological storage organ, dense with protein reserves, lipids, and a compound called vitellogenin that allows a single bee to live for 5 to 6 months rather than the 5 to 6 weeks of a summer worker. That fat body fuels the metabolic heat of the winter cluster from within. It enables nurse bees to produce the brood food that sustains any late winter brood the queen initiates. It buffers the colony against the combined stress of cold temperatures, dwindling stores, and the long weeks between January and the first pollen sources of spring. And here is the narrow window that most modern beekeeping schedules completely miss. Those fat bees must be larvae at the precise moment high-protein pollen is available and cycling actively through the hive. If the late-season nectar flow has ended and the colony's pollen stores are already depleted, if the beekeeper has pulled the last super and moved on, then the bees being raised in that window are not fat bees. They look like fat bees on the surface of a frame. They fill cells the same way. They cluster normally as autumn sets in. But their fat bodies are thin. Their vitellogenin reserves are insufficient. And come February, when the cluster reaches its biological limit, it does not hold. Appalachian beekeepers of the 1930s watched their late-season forage with the same intensity they gave their spring buildup. They knew which plants held pollen in August: goldenrod, aster, ironweed, white snake root, where it grew along the creek hollows. They positioned their apiaries in valleys and on ridge edges where these plants bloomed late and bloomed heavily. And they timed their honey harvest not purely by what was capped and ready, but by what the colony still needed to complete its final brood cycle properly. They did not pull the last super without asking what the colony was still doing with the season. That restraint was not generosity, it was precision. If you value biology-based beekeeping, consider subscribing. Here is where the divergence begins. The industrialization of beekeeping through the mid-20th century brought with it a production logic. Extract at each stage, maximize yield, manage the harvest on the operator's schedule rather than the colony's biological schedule. As operations scaled, as migratory practices expanded, as the commercial emphasis shifted toward honey output, the timing of the final brood cycle began drifting away from biological precision and toward operational convenience. Supers were pulled when the season said pull. Colonies were moved when logistics required. The colony's internal calendar, the one written in fat body chemistry, was not consulted. The consequences accumulated slowly, and they were difficult to isolate. Winter losses rose. The causes were attributed to the most visible pressures: parasites, pesticide drift, forage collapse. All of these are real. None should be minimized. But a colony entering winter with physiologically underdeveloped bees is already compromised before any of those pressures arrive. It begins the season short, and when the spring collapse comes, the record reads parasites or starvation, not late-season protein deficit. Because that deficit is invisible at inspection, it leaves no trace on the frames. The beekeeper looks at dead-out comb in March and reads the story wrong, because the story began the previous August. Strong colony, thin cluster, the most common hidden failure in modern winter management. The Appalachian discipline, and it is better described as a discipline than a technique, rested on a single organizing principle. The winter cluster is built in summer. Every decision made from August forward is a direct investment in February. Beekeepers who held that principle managed differently at every stage. They did not rush the late harvest. They did not move colonies during the final brood cycle. They watched pollen coming in during late August, the way a spring beekeeper watches nectar. When late forage looked thin, they adjusted, not in October, but in late July, before the window opened. Because adjusting inside a narrow window is far harder than preparing for it. Here is what the biology makes clear, and what many modern references still do not state plainly enough. Supplemental syrup in autumn does not replace pollen. It cannot. Syrup provides carbohydrate energy. It allows the cluster to generate warmth and maintain minimum metabolic function. But it does not build a fat body. It does not supply vitellogenin. A colony wintered on syrup and insufficient pollen will cluster, will consume its stores, and will begin failing in late January or February, not from hunger in the simple sense, but from physiological exhaustion, from bees whose biological reserves were never adequate for the duration they were asked to sustain. Pollen supplement, when it is used, must reach the colony before the last summer brood cycle begins, not after. The timing is not flexible. Across most of the Appalachian range and the broader mid-Atlantic region, that critical window typically runs from approximately the third week of August through the second week of September, shifting earlier at higher elevations, where late-season forage is genuinely abundant, where goldenrod and aster are heavy, and the pollen board shows consistent, diverse loads through August. The colony may not require supplementation at all. The supplement is a targeted correction for when natural forage is thin, not a seasonal default. Miss the window by 2 weeks, and the brood already developing in the hive will not benefit from anything placed in front of the entrance afterward. The fat body is built during the larval and early adult stage. Once a bee has emerged from her cell without those reserves, nothing that follows will fully restore them. Temperature acts as the hard boundary. Once ambient temperatures stay consistently below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, foraging ceases, pollen collection stops. The colony enters conservation mode and will not shift back into building mode until spring. Any brood raised after that threshold draws entirely on the reserves of the nurse bees attending it, reserves that must come from fat bodies already developed earlier in the season. If those fat bodies are thin, the nurse bees feeding late brood are drawing from an account that is already overdrawn. The colony does not fail suddenly. It fails by degrees, quietly, across the coldest weeks of the year. The cluster shrinks from the outside in. The bees at the perimeter go first. And by the time the remaining population is too small to maintain cluster temperature, the margin for recovery has long passed. The Appalachian beekeeper of 1935 had no instrument for measuring fat body development. He could not peer inside a bee and assess her vitellogenin levels. What he had was the pollen landing on the board, the weight of a frame lifted at the corner, the color and variety of the loads coming in during the last weeks of August. He had observation built across years, and the firm understanding that his colonies were not replaceable from a catalog. These were locally adapted bees, bees that had survived the winters of his specific ridgeline, his specific hollow, his specific elevation. Their resilience was not generic, it was earned, generation by generation, in that exact place. That weight of irreplaceability drove the precision of the method. It made beekeepers careful in August, in a way that modern beekeeping, with its access to replacement packages and nucleus colonies, does not always demand. The buffer of availability has replaced the buffer of attention. And the biology has noticed. What most beekeepers misunderstand is this: late winter colony loss is often a late summer failure wearing a winter mask. The colony that fails in February was compromised in August. The bees that could not hold the cluster were bees that never received what they needed during the 6-week window that mattered most. Recognizing that shift in timing does not require new equipment or new techniques. It requires a different question at inspection. Not what did this colony die from, but what did this colony need in August, and did it get it? The colony has not changed. The winter bee still requires what it has always required. The biology of fat body development is not a recent discovery, it is a rediscovery. The practices of mountain beekeepers who achieved 4% winter loss rates were not primitive. They were precisely calibrated to the biology that governs every colony wintering in temperate climates. That method was not abandoned because it failed. It was displaced as the model of beekeeping changed around it, and the bees bore the cost of that displacement, quietly, every winter since. The bees building the winter cluster this August deserve the same scrutiny that Appalachian beekeepers once gave them. Without question, in the heat of late summer, 6 weeks before the first frost, when the work that determines February is still possible, that window opens whether beekeepers are watching for it or not. If you have ever pulled a late honey super and then found your colony struggling by January, leave a comment describing what your late-season forage looked like that year. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping breakdowns.